Okay, so very good day to everybody watching this video. My name is Paul. I'll be your tour guide today, and we're focusing on the wonderful area in London known as Fleet Street. It's one of my favorite streets to explore, and yeah, the tour will last about 30-35 minutes long or so. Okay, so I hope you enjoy. Just going to figure out technology and share my screen to get the old PowerPoint ready. There we go. To move myself up here. Okay, so welcome to Fleet Street, well, if you know Fleet Street quite well, you'll know this isn't actually Fleet Street. This is Temple Bar. It was a gateway built by Sir Christopher Wren, very famous architect who appeared in London after the Great Fire of London itself in 1666. Well, he had already been in the court of Charles II before that, but he would be commissioned to build some of the most famous buildings still surviving today in the City of London, including this archway. Now, this would have led you into the City of London for nearly 200 years. And it would have been based at the beginning of Fleet Street, but it has since been removed. So a little bit more about that later on. So, what to expect today? We're going to learn a little bit on the law itself. We'll do a little bit on the news as well, the various newspapers that sprung up around Fleet Street from the 1700s onwards. A little bit on the banks, banking industry was quite big on Fleet Street as well, capping off with the Bank of England building itself, which was located to Cornhill in the first half of the 18th century. And yeah, so we'll have a little look at that building later on as well, that little bank there. And a fair bit on the pubs then as well. Okay, so this is myself and my friend in the Old Cheshire Cheese, one of my favorite places to visit on Fleet Street, and you'll find out why later on. So, where is Fleet Street? So, just as always, just to get our bearings, little Google map here. We've got the River Thames on the south side of the picture, the image here. And you've got, well, this is Blackfriars Bridge. And the red line, this little section here, is just indicating the street we're going to look at today. Okay, so we'll venture up. I'll show you some images of St. Paul's at the top of Ludgate Hill. The old River Fleet used to flow down this way, the right side of the red line, down towards where Blackfriars Bridge is here. And it was covered over in the 1860s to make way for the new Farringdon Road and Farringdon Street that would be built in the 1870s then as well. Okay, so the archway was deemed a little too small for the growing horse and carriages and soon to be buses and motorized vehicles that were coming into London towards the end of the 19th century. So an architect called Sir Horace Jones was commissioned to design this. Okay, so on your map on the left-hand side, we're at the beginning of Fleet Street here. This is the memorial to Temple Bar. Okay, so it's a large pilaster or column in the center here. You got the dragon, sometimes referred to as a griffin, sitting on top of it. And just to get it from the profile, so as you enter London, you always pass by the Dragon's Head first, and then the wings. And as you leave London, you'll leave with the wings first and then the head. So you will see silver dragons placed around the city of London, and that's all they're doing. They're indicating that you're either entering or leaving the 1 square mile. So on one side, as you enter the city of London, you'll see this statue in the niche. This is Edward VII. But at the time of the placement, which was 1870, he was still Prince Albert, the Prince of Wales. So his mother is on the other side then. So just look at the other profile. So here's his mother. Zoom in on that. So Queen Victoria then. So her son, Prince Albert, would become then Edward VII upon her death in 1901. So here she's signified as the monarch with the symbols of monarchy in Britain, the scepter, this rod, and then you've got the orb here. So the scepter here, the orb here, and then she's wearing the crown on top. So yes, it was designed by Sir Horace Jones, who designed other famous places in London like Smithfields Market, Leadenhall Market, and most famously Tower Bridge. Okay, so three institutions that sort of grew up around the area of Fleet Street, one of them being the law. Okay, so in Britain, we have what we call Inns of Courts. An Inn of Court is where barristers complete their training to represent clients in a court of law. So we have three levels to our legal system. You have solicitors who do all the paperwork and do all the legal work proceeding a court case, preceding the court case. And if it does go to court, then a solicitor will contact one of the famous Inns of Courts for barristers who specialise in whatever type of case they're dealing with, if it is going to go to court. Now, the third level is the the judges then who sit in the courts. So this is not anything to do with the legal system in a way. It's just a very beautiful building, the Prince Henry Room. It's one of the last timber frame buildings left in the city of London. Because after the Great Fire of London, they realized that timber was not such a great building material if the buildings were so close together as they used to typically be. So they put in this law after the Great Fire, so all the timber frames were brought down and to remove this hazard. However, the gentleman who owned this building at the time thought, you know what, I rather like this building, so he covered it in a plaster, like stucco, and covered up the timbers. And it was only rediscovered back in the First World War, after the First World War, with some builders were doing renovation works and they happened to come across it. Thankfully, they kept it, they preserved it, they didn't go back to the old laws. And this little archway is very, very special because this does take you into Inner and Middle Temple, two of the most famous Inns of Court. There are four main ones: Inner Temple, Middle Temple, Lincoln Inn Fields, which is to the north of Fleet Street, and then Gray's Inn, which is to the north of Chancery Lane. So they're the big four then that barristers tend to register with and have their chambers, which is just a fancy word for office. One other thing is this archway more than likely was used by William Shakespeare because this building was built in 1607, and William Shakespeare used to premiere his plays in Middle Temple Hall to King James I. After that, so Shakespeare would have recognized this and many other buildings like this that were there before the Great Fire. Shakespeare having died in 1614, he actually premiered a few of his plays to Elizabeth I as well. The last play he premiered in Middle Temple Hall was his Twelfth Night play back in 1602, a few months before she would pass away in 1603. This is Inner Temple Hall. So this is a medieval building here, one of the oldest that survives as well. Basically, the name Temple comes from the Knights Templar who used to own all this land before they were deemed illegal by Edward the First and then his son. And basically, that was because the Knights Templar were exceptional at business and they would be the big money lenders. At a time when the Christian church can lend money, you had two options. You had the Jewish community, who would be big, big money lenders who came across with William the Conqueror then for that sole purpose to keep his royal coffers topped up. And Edward the First then he decided to change everything, so he banished the Jewish community, and he also made the Templar Knights illegal, following the sort of Pope's orders. The Pope would be doing this because the Pope had the same reason. He owed the Templars a lot of money, so to get rid of that debt, he just made them illegal. So the Knights Templar then, this land was seized, handed over to the Knights Hospitaller, who was the Order of St. John's, and they would then dedicate or give it to the law community. So that's where the Inner and Middle Temple was set up originally. Down on the other side of Fleet Street, so the north side, if you look to your map, Fleet Street here, and then if you go behind the Royal Courts of Justice here, which is just on the Strand, you come on to Carey Street. I'll just magnify that. Carey Street, this building here was the old bankruptcy court. So it lent itself to a term, a phrase, to be on Queer Street. To be on Queer Street meant that you were broke, and it's a corruption of this word Carey. And yeah, that goes the old bankruptcy court with Sir Thomas More up here in the niche above the main doorway. And if we go just a little bit down Carey Street, this is the entrance, one of the many entrances into Lincoln Inn Fields. Beautiful little bookstore just through the arch on the right hand side, Wildy's, where many solicitors, barristers, judges, etc., go to get their law books from. So yeah, I couldn't go in here. Builders were working in its private ground, so COVID they tend to lock it down. You need special permission. Normally, you can't just go through here into Lincoln Field, having a little explore. Some nice churches in there as well. But the builders just left the door open for a moment, so I didn't decide to stick my head in and grab a quick photo of Wildy's. The Seven Stars, one of the first pubs I'll mention. This has to do with the Dutch. The Dutch have a thing with the Seven Stars. So typically, any pubs you see with Seven-star references normally set up by the Dutch community here in London. It is a pub where you'll find many lawyers and barristers, solicitors hanging out because the Royal Courts of Justice is just opposite this little pub. Really nice little pub too. Okay, so the banks then. Banks, let's see. Here we go. This is Seahore and Company, Hoare. This building made out of Bath stone, wonderful sandstone, and it is basically the last family run bank, privately owned bank in the United Kingdom. All the others are tied into the big conglomerates. There was another family run bank down the street to the right called Childs, Childes. And a few years ago, that was consumed by RBS, the Royal Bank of Scotland. Seahore and Company is the last family-run bank, established in the 1670s, 1674, I think. And there's two cousins who own a partnership, and by their traditions, they've been doing this since the 17th century. Uh, Owning partner must stay in the bank at all times, reside there, so there are apartments on the upper floors then as well. Just across the street, we have an old branch of the Bank of England. This is now a pub. You might be able to make out the chandeliers through the windows. Fantastic pub. I can get any photographs inside because of lockdown, but when lockdown ends, this is a great one to go to. This is the Royal Courts of Justice here, just to the left-hand side of the photograph. This alleyway takes down onto Carey Street, where the Seven Stars pub was, and the entrance to Lincoln Inn Fields. The Dragon's just to our left-hand side. So we're just moving up Fleet Street a little bit. Then we'll jump right off Fleet Street, so ignore the map for this one. This is the top past St. Paul's Cathedral. You keep on going down Cheapside, and you'll get yourself into Bank Junction. So this building in front of us is the Royal Exchange. This is the third building set up in 1840. And the architect was a big fan of the Pantheon. Yeah, the Pantheon. I always get the Pantheon and Parthenon mixed up. Parthenon's Greek, Pantheon's Italian. And it's the famous church in Rome with the hole in the ceiling of it. So this was built to sort of mirror that. The front is not religious. This pediment here, it's not religious iconography. It has to do with trade and so on, because this is where they used to trade. It's the third building on the original site of the very first Royal Exchange, which opened in 1652 by a gentleman called Thomas Gresham. And you've got Arthur Wellesley, his statue in the centre there, just on his horse, and James Greathead over to the right then. He's the guy who came up with the Greathead Tunnel, or the Greathead Shield, which helped develop the London Underground. And then just to the left of that is this building. This is the Bank of England, the second building. The first building on this site, it used to be the Mercers Guildhall when the Bank of England was formed in 1694. 1720, Sir John Soane built this building then. It takes up an entire one city square block. You've got the feature of the curtain wall wrapping around it then. And the Bank of England is essentially our national bank in the sense it was set up by multiple banking families in order to lend the government money in a regulated fashion then. It still has that job today, issuing bonds and so on for debts. And it's also our version of Fort Knox, you might have heard of in the United States of America. They would hold our metal reserves. So precious metals include gold, silver, and now platinum as well. Really nice little museum down the west side of the bank. It's free, so when COVID ends, you can go in there and explore it if you're interested in money and commodities. Uh, Banks issued notes, okay, so promises on payment, whereas a mint issues coins. Those are the two big differences. So our Royal Mint's over in Wales, but the Bank of England's based here. And yeah, in the Bank of England, you can actually lift up a gold bar. It weighs about 13 kilograms. And when I lifted it 3, 4 years ago now, it was valued around £330,000. So yeah, it was pretty fun to do. The amount of security cameras that are looking at you at that particular moment is unbelievable. Because whilst gold is quite dense, it's quite a heavy metal, it's also quite malleable. So they're always very worried of people scraping it with their fingernails and taking little souvenirs home and the little gold bar get lighter and lighter and lighter. So there are quite a few cameras on you as you lift it up. But it is a nice experience, so go for it. Might as well. Okay, so the third big institution then on Fleet Street is the newspaper industry. Okay, here we have a building on the right. It's just or on the right side of our screens, and it's just showing you a list of some of the oldest newspapers that started off around this area of Fleet Street. So the Dundee Courier, the People's Journal, the People's Friend, the Sunday Post, the Times, the Financial Times, the Sun, the Observer, the Metro. What else started off? The News of the World. The Express, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph. They all started off in and around this area. Most banks moved out of the area following Rupert Murdoch in 1980s, when computer generated printing processes began to take over the old fashioned style, and they wanted bigger premises and purpose built ones for the new computer technology. So Rupert Murdoch moved his two papers, the News of the World and the Sun, out to an area in East London called Wapping, and many of the other papers followed suit because it sort of made sense, because all deliveries of the paper to be printed on and so on could just go to one centralized location. Excuse me. But this is actually still used for printing, not a newspaper or a tabloid, but a comic book. This is the headquarters of Beano. Here we have Dennis the Menace looking rather glum. Don't worry, Dennis, we'll all get out soon enough after lockdown ends. So yes, the Beano, Dennis the Menace, Minnie the Minx, the Backstreet Kids, all these guys and girls created here. Mostly digital now, but they still do publish their annual calendar, their annuals here once a year as well. And then right next to this is another story. Basically, this is a little tiny alleyway. It's called Hen and Chicken Court. Down this alleyway, if you take a walk, you'll come into the court itself, Hen and Chicken Court. And this is where it was believed in the sort of 1700s that a gentleman had a barber shop. And he was nicknamed then the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, who used to take a little bit more off your head than your hair. He would take your life by cutting your throat. Then he would send your body using a flip chair through a trapdoor to his next door neighbour, Mrs. Lovett, who would cut you up, put you in a pie, and sell you on to the rich people. I'm, of course, talking about Sweeney Todd, the demon barber. Sweeney Todd was a piece of fiction, okay, created by the Daily Courant in what was recognized as a string of pearls. String of Pearls is a weekly publication, a weekly story, just once a week, another thing would come out. The reporter, however, was writing it as if it was actually happening in London, reporting it as if it was a news story. So it scared the life out of people. Eventually, they would retract the story and so on for scaring people too much. But yeah, this was where the Daily Courant headquarters was located, this big building. This is the very top end of Fleet Street if you look to your maps on the left hand side. So St. Paul Cathedral, just at the top of Ludgate Hill. This is Ludgate Circus. The River Fleet used to flow left to right, starting off at Hampstead Heath in the north and entering the Thames down to the right hand side. So the Daily Courant was the first daily newspaper established back in 1707. Another pub famous for the journalists and lawyers, in a sense, El Vino's. So Alvino's was a meeting place for journalists to meet their legal contacts, their sources. So if there's any big cases happening over in the Royal Courts of Justice, for example, you would come in here, meet your contacts, get the story, get the scoop, and away you go, run it to press. It was one of the last places in London, actually, where women can order drinks at the bar. They only changed that in the 1980s or so. And many famous reporters have drank here over the years as well. G.K. Chesterton. He wrote Father Brown stories and so on in the 20th century. He didn't. He was a novelist and a philosopher, and he didn't really particularly like writing for newspapers or magazines, but he would take the jobs. And the legend has it that he would come to Alvino's, get blind drunk, write some sort of story, and then submit it to his editor that day, and they would publish it. So yeah, he was quite a character. Um, a couple of phrases then. People like phrases where things come from. So since we're here, a legal term was gossip. Okay, GOSSIP, gossip, to speak of someone. Um, this comes from the fact that solicitors, lawyers, whatever term you wish to use, hundreds of years ago in taverns and stuff would meet their clients in pubs and taverns. But everyone would know that people would do this. So if you were having a case and you had a prosecutor or defender opposite you in the case, you would then hire someone to go sit at the next table from your opposition and listen into what they were saying. Then that person would come back and report it to you. So go sit became gossip, and that's where that comes from. Bar, my American cousins always like to say, "Oh, bar is an American word for a pub." It's not actually. Again, it started off here in London. Bar used to stand for three separate letters. Okay, BAR. Used to be what was printed up or painted up on the outside of windows, and it stood for beer and rooms. Okay, beer and rooms. What hotels used to identify as, or a way for them to advertise. Okay, so that's where bar and gossip come from. Okay, this is another publication that's still here. This building at the top of Fleet Street was the old Reuters building, so World Press. And then this is to this day the Metro. Okay, so if you're familiar with London, the Metro is the free newspaper that you'll find on public transport, on buses and the underground. Not so much nowadays because they're trying to limit the amount of things that people come in contact with. But yeah, this is where it is published. Right opposite, well, pretty much opposite that, is the old Telegraph building. So the Telegraph building just here. This lovely clock was actually manufactured in Birmingham. And this is where Goldman Sachs used to have some of their offices, Peterborough Court. And then they've now moved. Now, one thing we say as tour guides is to our guests, when we're walking through the streets, we always say, keep your eyes up, look at the top building. Normally, what we're trying to get people to look out for, especially if they're on their own, is blue plaques that normally give you a little bit of history of the pub, the building, the church, whatever it was famous for. It's normally someone who lived there in the past. And on Fleet Street, it's a little bit different. When you're walking up or down Fleet Street, if you look to the ground, especially in the alleyways, you'll see plaques like this. So remember Hen and Chicken Court, Sweeney Todd? So that was where the Sheffield Daily Telegraph London offices used to be. So you'll see a plaque just like this one. If you go on up then to Bolt Court, you would have the Sun. Here they have one of their headlines of Elvis Presley, the King, having died aged 42. This one looks a little bit strange with Space Invaders here. This is just identifying that the newspaper industry moved away from Fleet Street in the 1980s because of computer technology. But they're all the way up and down Fleet Street, so definitely check out those. Okay, so this church then, it's just past the Reuters building, the Metro building, as you walk up towards Ludgate, towards St. Paul's. And this is known as St. Bride's. It's a corruption of St. Bridget's, which is funny because St. Bridget is the patron saint of beer. And Fleet Street is well versed in beer. many pubs here. But it's also known as the Journalist Church. Okay, if you go inside St. Bridget's or St. Bride's, you can see along the pews, the wooden benches, that they have the names of the famous newspapers up and down them. There's certain seating areas for the Telegraph, the Sun, the Daily Mail, the Express, etc. It's also where they hold memorials for any journalists who have died or have gone missing whilst reporting abroad or in this country, either or. And Rupert Murdoch, he got married here to Jerry Hall. So back in 2016, yeah, the pair of them got married here. This is a Christopher Wren church, okay? So a very unique spire. Christopher was commissioned to build around 53 churches after the Great Fire of London. So he always, the one thing he could make really unique. So sometimes he couldn't do too much on the interior or the exterior, but the spires he could really go for. So this spire, after he completed St. Bride's, after the Great Fire, lent itself to a baker, a guy called William Rich, who lived up on Ludgate Hill. His daughter was getting married, so he wanted to do something very special for his daughter. And he remembered the spire, he would have seen it every day, so he thought he'd come up with a special type of cake for his daughter's wedding day. And this is the inspiration then of the tiered wedding cake that you'll see around most of the Western world then, and the rest of the world. Many people like this design. Beautiful little church. Okay, this is a gentleman called, or house, sorry, called Dr. Samuel Johnson. There's the gentleman there. Samuel Johnson was attributed to have developed the real first clear English dictionary. There were English dictionaries before Johnson. It was just the fact that it would have read something along the lines of this: a dog, animal; a cat, animal; a rose, flower; a lily, flower. So he didn't think it was the best descriptive term. So he goes about redesigning it. Takes him and a team about 9 years to come up with the first full English dictionary. You can actually see one of those dictionaries if you visit his house, which is a nice little museum, or if you go around the corner to my favorite pub, the Old Cheshire Cheese. Um, you can say ye or yay if you want to. Just for your information, this sort of Y symbol, YE, was a printing technique. Okay, it's a thorn, and it was the combinations of the letters TH. Okay, so the TH became a thorn, so it would save printers an extra character and a bit more printing space. So people who could read around the time of these 18th, 19th, 20th century wouldn't have often said ye old Cheshire Cheese. Certainly not ye olde. Don't add the E on. But they would have just read it as the Old Cheshire Cheese. And this old pub was one of the first pubs to be reopened after the Great Fire of London, opening in 1667. There's a wonderful plaque out the front of it that has one mistake. It says William the First was reigning when it's meant to say William the Fourth. But yeah, it's got all the kings and queens from Charles II all the way right down to Elizabeth II, then our current monarch. So many writers have drank in this pub that it is known as the Writers' Pub. Okay, so writers and journalists, novelists and journalists alike have drank in here. Polly the parrot, male or female, they're not quite sure about, but Polly is still in the pub. And it was read after her death in 1926, I believe she died. Over 200 international and national newspapers wrote an obituary to Polly. It used to be a favorite thing for journalists to do, to go in and teach Polly to swear and say derogatory terms about other newspapers, so that when those journalists would come in, they'd trigger Polly and get her to shout some slurs towards the other papers. It was reported as well at the end of the First World War that Polly imitated the popping of a champagne over a bottle over 400 times as well. But famous writers who have drank in this pub have included Alfred Lord Tennyson, who famously wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade, not in this pub. I'll stress that, he didn't write it here, but that's what he's known for. Charge of the Light Brigade, about the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War. Crimea War took place in Crimea between 1853 and 56. Then you had T.S. Eliot, an American gentleman, worked for the Bank of England. His series of poems about some cats was then turned into Cats the Musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I used to love writing about the various churches around London as well. Then you have Mark Twain, who wrote The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. So you have to drink here as well. Other Americans that drank here included Theodore Roosevelt and J. Edgar Hoover. They used to both drink in the Old Cheshire Cheese. The creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, used to drink here. More likely was a good friend of his, is this gentleman. Now, this gentleman sat in this pub and wrote the immortal words, Marley was dead to begin with. So he began noting out and planning Christmas Carol in the Old Cheshire Cheese. Of course, the most famous version of the Christmas Carol is clearly this one, the good old Muppets Christmas Carol, Michael Caine, famous Londoner. But yeah, so Charles Dickens used to drink in the Old Cheshire Cheese as well. So to carry on with the pubs, I know we've seen a few already because they link in to the lawyers, the journalists, the bankers, but just a few more that I'm a favourite of. The building I mentioned, the Prince Henry Rooms, the first timber frame building we saw at the beginning of the tour, this sits just up the street from us, the Old Cock Tavern. From around the same sort of time period, although this building sat on the opposite side of the street until they built the International Arbitration Centre. And then they moved it across just to build their big square building. But it's a bit like a TARDIS, if you know Doctor Who. You know, you go into this pub and then it opens up at the back. Pretty nice little pub, actually. Next pub, the Tipperary. Yes, the old tip. The Tipperary was bought by an Irishman from an Englishman. It's not the beginning of a joke, it's just what happened back in 1707. And it used to be called the Old Boar's Head. And it was managed and owned by an Irish gentleman from County Tipperary, hence the name. Many people say that the song is a long way to Tipperary, is referencing this pub because other London locations are using the song. You know, goodbye Piccadilly, farewell Leicester Square. All very close to here. Fantastic pub. Still managed by an Irish family, but they're from Killarney, a beautiful part of the island as well. So that's a great Irish pub, especially on St. Patrick's Day. So yeah. The Old Bell. This is one of Christopher Wren's pubs. This opened in 1670, so a few years after the Great Fire of London. And this was primarily one of the earliest buildings that Christopher Wren built in the city. He was commissioned to build 53 churches, one cathedral, which is St. Paul's, many municipal buildings, so government buildings, lots of private dwellings, and 2 pubs. And out of all those buildings, he decided to build a pub first. Good man. Well, like Christopher. He does have a logical reason for doing this, however, and that was because the Great Fire itself had destroyed around 80% of the city of London. So about 35,000 buildings had been destroyed. And basically this meant then that the workmen had nowhere to go to get out of the rain or get at least one warm meal during the day and, of course, a few pints after work. So Wren and other architects decided to each build a couple of pubs. Christopher built the Old Bell here, and then the Old Watling behind his first church, St. Mary Le Bow on Watling Street. And they say Wren would recognize the front of this pub. Not the lights here, that's been changed. They reckon the paving stones on the inside are original from 1670. And inside, it does look nice, but they've got a couple of galvan machines and stuff like that as well. At the back of the pub, then you come out and you're in the courtyard of St. Bride's Church. Then remember the Journalist Church? So that's where that one is as well. And I just want to put this view in because if you come out of the Old Cheshire Cheese and then look to your left, you'll be looking up the Ludgate Hill towards St. Paul's Cathedral. So you can see off to the left, see this building that slants over? Well, that's the Leadenhall building, also known as the Cheese Grater. And over to the right-hand side, just behind these buildings, you would have the Scalpel. Both these buildings lean away from St. Paul's Cathedral. That's because this is a protected view, okay? The first big building that went up after St. Paul's was completed in 1711 So you weren't allowed to build anything taller than it until 1969 when the NatWest Tower goes up and the Aviva Tower goes up as well. But what they did say was because you used to be able to see this dome from 25 miles away as you approach London, they would protect certain views. So it has to be kept in mind whenever you're planning a building in the city of London that you don't block the view. Westminster, the House of Parliament, same thing. It had protected views for the Victoria Tower and Big Ben as well. And just lastly, the end of the tour. So this is us looking down the River Fleet. It was quite a big river. You can see either side there. These buildings are on the site of the old river banks. And then in the 1860s, it was closed over to allow for Farringdon Road and Farringdon Street to be built for easier access. The viaduct, the flyover at the very end, was the first flyover in London, which was completed, I think, in the 1870s then, and the Holborn Viaduct. And this is where the Daily Courant building was that we saw earlier on. So Fleet Street just up to your right hand side. Now, that Sweeney Todd story I mentioned at the beginning, the writer did have some basis to compose that story. And that was because what used to happen when this was a functioning river from Hampstead Heath, way down the end of the river up north London, flowing down to Fleet Street behind us. What used to happen was you'd have lots of butchers up and down the river's edge, and whenever they were done with their carcass or whatever meat that was left, they would throw it into the river. Now, this river was used as an open sewer, as were the other rivers of London, the Tyburn, the Westbourne, etc. So, what used to happen with all this waste, all this filth, but poor people used to go downstream, wait for the butcher to throw their meat in, fish it out, and then put that into pies and sell it back to the rich folk. So that's where that sort of basis of that story came from. But there you go, quick little jaunt up and down Fleet Street. So whenever the lockdown ends, April 12th, for us to be able to have a pint outside the pubs, then May 17th, if we're using the current roadmap. Still, then that's when we can go into these pubs again for a bit of food and stuff like that. So it's a wonderful area to explore. So yeah, please make the most of it. Yeah, you can always visit my Facebook page if you like this tour. Just leave a little review on the actual page, not the profile. Beth Walking Tours. Instagram, my Instagram's there. Beth Walking Tours. My Twitter is exactly the same. Beth Walking Tours. And yeah. So that's this week's tour. Thanks very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your afternoon then. So take care, guys.